Hi, I'm Reed Peterson, and welcome to Grief Refuge. I really appreciate you making the time for this important conversation, and it warms my heart to know that you're here listening today. For you see, Grief Refuge is a very unique podcast. If this is your first time listening, welcome. If you have listened to previous episodes, welcome back. At Grief Refuge, you get the deeper understandings of the grief process. This podcast is about validating your feelings, taking time to reflect, and spending quality time with your self-care. It's also about learning healthy ways to manage grief. At Grief Refuge, you can feel comforted, hopeful, and a sense of peace in regards to your loss and life moving forward. Through the stories and conversations shared on this podcast, my intention is to provide companionship, insight, and a soothing voice to help you through the darker feelings that grief brings up. Grief is a really hard thing to journey through. I'm glad you're here, and I promise to do everything I can to provide more support to you. Before we begin, let's go over a little housekeeping. Because of the depth and the nature of this topic, it may be more beneficial to not multitask while listening. Rather, I invite you to use this time for your self-care and also your personal reflection. Use this time to relax and allow your grief-related feelings to run their course. Use this time to mourn your loss. In addition to this podcast, I also invite you to download the Grief Refuge app for more support. The Grief Refuge app is a daily companion to help soothe and comfort you throughout the grief journey. It provides a daily audio message about the grief experience, intended to help validate you through this difficult process. You can get the Grief Refuge app from the App Store on your smartphone. Thank you, and let's move on to today's topic. Today I'm joined by Helen Bauer and Jerry Fenter from the Heart of Hospice. Helen has worked in nursing for over 30 years, specializing in hospice and end-of-life care for over 10. She is a certified hospice and palliative care registered nurse with a background in compliance and consulting. As a co-owner of the Heart of Hospice, she provides end-of-life education and consulting services for both hospice providers and consumers. Helen's passion for quality end-of-life care can be heard on the Heart of Hospice podcast, as she leads discussions on hospice philosophy, how to get the most from a hospice experience, and advanced care planning. Jerry Fenter holds certificates in fundamentals of spiritual care, in palliative care and advanced practice of spiritual care from California State University in San Marcos Institute in Palliative Care. He has served in hospice and palliative care service for 11 years and educates and trains other spiritual counselors in best practices of spiritual care. He has served on the Texas Health and Human Service Palliative Care Interdisciplinary Advisory Council since 2019. He is currently the System Director of Spiritual Counselors for Harbor Healthcare System. Jerry is also the co-creator and co-host of the Heart of Hospice podcast. Our conversation today helps to emphasize the importance of quality care towards the end of life and educates on how grief is managed within the hospice setting. I sincerely hope you enjoy this meaningful conversation. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with Jerry Fenter and Helen Bauer, and they represent the Heart of Hospice. Today, we're going to learn a little bit about their mission, their values, their vision, and their purpose. And I'm excited to share the conversation with you because in the little I know about Jerry and Helen's work, I can tell that they have a passion for education and what they do. So we're going to learn about that. Let's start with you, Jerry. Jerry, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do for the Heart of Hospice?
So Helen and I are partners in the Heart of Hospice podcast. And, my role in the Heart of Hospice is to do some of the production work, the behind the scenes work, if you will, making sure that the podcast is edited and quality control and all that. However, in my day job, I work as a spiritual counselor in hospice. And so my background is in hospice. I started out in my career as a pastor, clergy, and worked in clergy work for over 30 years, and then transitioned into working in hospice. And I've been in hospice now for about 11 years and have found my calling in hospice. It really fits who I am and what I do. And I love the kind of meaning that I get from being involved with people on their end of life journey, being able to help them on those occasions. And so our purpose in the Heart of Hospice is to educate people about hospice, because there's so many myths about what hospice does and doesn't do. Lots of misunderstandings. And so our role is to educate people on what hospice is really about. Because when people think about hospice, the first thing they think about is death. But for people like Helen and me who work in hospice, our first thought about hospice is not about death. Our first thought is about giving people quality of life. We know that the quantity has now been limited. Quantity of life has been limited, but the quality of life is what we're working on. And so our goal in the Heart of Hospice is to try to educate people about hospice and to overcome some of the myths and misunderstandings out there.
Jerry, I extremely appreciate what you shared in regards to that. That's such a good, helpful explanation into where your heart's focused. We're going to come back to that. Helen, we're going to jump over to you. We're going to learn a little bit about your role with the Heart of Hospice. What do you focus on there?
Well, I'm a hospice and palliative care certified registered nurse. And I also have about 11 years of experience and 30 years experience as a nurse, most of it in community-based care. And my role in the Heart of Hospice is educator, encourager, connecting people with resources. We talk a lot about educating and encouraging people to get the best out of their experience when it comes to end-of-life care. And I feel like my role is to be an advocate for anybody who has any affiliation with hospice care, whether you're consuming it as a patient or a family member, or you're providing it as a hospice professional. I want to make sure that both parties, all parties, get the most out of that experience. I don't do patient care anymore, obviously. I work mostly in the compliance and regulatory realm, but the Heart of Hospice is more about education for the public and for hospice providers, just so that people have the best end-of-life experience they can have. And like Jerry was saying, there's so many misunderstandings, or I don't like to use the word ignorance, but people are just unaware of the benefits of hospice. And I think with good education, so people know what they're supposed to be getting and what it can be, I think that's my role, is to educate people. I think they're better consumers. You get better care when you know what you're supposed to get.
Thank you, Helen. So let's wear a business hat for a second. I looked at the Heart of Hospice website and I saw that some of the audience who attends these educational experiences are caregivers. Sometimes they're patients, sometimes they're volunteers for the hospice organization, and sometimes they're, the professional organization themselves. So when you're out advocating and you're out educating, who in your experience do you find that's naturally called to fill these seats to learn more? Helen, let's start with you.
I think a lot of our audience for the podcast are hospice providers, other hospice professionals. Those are the people we get the most feedback from when we get suggestions for topics, questions about hospice care. It's mostly coming from other hospice professionals. So I think it's a lot of our colleagues, a lot of our peers out in the end of life industry.
So I feel like I'm starting to get clarified on an assumption I've been holding. It sounds like a lot of the education is focused through the podcast you provide. Is there live events too, or is there Zoom meetings?
Generally, we only publish a podcast. We do speak at different events. Helen and I both speak, sometimes together, sometimes separately, at hospice professional events. For instance, we will speak at a regional conference or a national conference. We just finished speaking at a national conference through the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization just a few months back. So we will do some of those live events, but most of the time our education is just through the podcast. One of the things that really inspired the podcast in the first place was that we both started at a time when there just wasn't that much information for hospice professionals on how to do the work that we're doing. Now, the more that we have become involved in education, the more that we have found others who are also involved in the educational realm about hospice. Well, we saw that there was a lack of information out there for hospice professionals. So when I started in this 11 years ago, I was looking for more information because I had never worked in hospice. I'd never worked in a healthcare setting. So when they came to me and they said, yes, you're going to go visit with the patients, you're going to help them, but you're also going to come back and then you're going to actually document about your visit. I'm sure that I looked like a deer in the headlights. I had no clue that I was going to have to do anything like that, which dumbfounded me. And I did have some training on how to do that, but I still felt lost. I didn't quite know how to do this or what my role was in a really deeper sense. So I began looking, and there just wasn't that much information out there. So one of the things that inspired us to start the podcast was to make sure that there was information, to provide that information, and to fill that need that many new hospice professionals need to learn how to do their job. And so the more that we can give information about hospice and to help those new people coming into hospice, we feel like we're doing not only a service to them, but also a service to the communities where they serve. Because if they can do their job better, they know how to do their job better, the patients and the families are going to get better quality service as well.
Thank you. I guess as you gauge what your listeners and learners want to understand, you track the topics. May I ask, what's the most requested or needed education information that your audience wants to understand, Helen?
Well, we talk about a whole variety of different things, everything from hospice philosophy and history, all the way over to self-care, which is a super hot topic these days. But I would say that self-care is probably one of the most, I want to say requested, but, we look at our downloads. Self-care episodes are one of the most downloaded topics that we have. People are very interested in that. And I think that's because hospice professionals a lot of times are natural caregivers. They're empaths. They are people who are constantly giving and doing for other people. And when you have a nature like that and you want to do it well for an extended period of time, you realize without the care that you need for yourself, you can't sustain that, not in any way that's valuable, that's worth doing. And so self-care is really one of the biggest topics. And we find ourselves coming back to that constantly, especially since the pandemic started. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of strain on the healthcare industry, and hospice has been the same. You know, we've experienced the same staffing shortages and the same pressures and the regulatory changes, money flow issues. And I think the stress of that has really made us aware that we need more intensive self-care than ever before. So I would say self-care. Jerry may weigh in that there's he would say a different topic, but self-care seems like it's been a big one.
How about your thoughts on that, Jerry?
Reed, I really think that one of the things that's also come to the forefront due to the pandemic has been the topic of grief. And we see a lot more people wanting to get information about grief, because there's just this collective grief that's present in our world because of so many different things that are happening out in not only in our country, but in the world at large. And so it's a very hot topic right now as well. We've covered it in several different podcasts. We've talked to several of our guests have been grief experts. And so it's become a fairly hot topic as well.
Appreciate that. I'm going to tie in the two, actually, grief and self-care as a collaborative. I'm willing to bet that a lot of people, I feel like I'm creating this formula here. You know, you have lower amounts of self-care, higher amounts of grief, and it equals perhaps some burnout. How about burnout? Is that showing up a lot these days, especially now that we're almost 2 years into the pandemic? Helen?
I would say absolutely. Absolutely. A higher level of stress, less time to take care of ourselves, lack of self-awareness. I think absolutely that you could patent that formula. You could copyright that, Reed, because I think that's totally true. I think that compassion fatigue feels different. And then it's not just the professional and the personal. It's like Jerry was saying, you take it out into your community. You take it out into a national level, the political and the racial and cultural grief that we feel as a nation, and then take that out globally, because it's not as if it's just our community or the United States dealing with the pandemic. It's the entire world. That's a lot of grief. It's a huge amount of grief.
It certainly is. You know, Helen, you mentioned compassion fatigue, and that really just jumped out at me. I think I saw that on the Heart of Hospice website also. Can you explain a little bit about the meaning of compassion fatigue?
Well, compassion fatigue in our industry is associated with the grief, the secondary grief that you feel watching other people's suffering and being their companion on the end of life journey, which is what, hospice is all about. We come alongside our patients and our families. And because a lot of us are empathic and hopefully compassionate people, we feel their suffering to a certain extent. So we take that on as a secondary grief. And compassion fatigue is the wear and tear that we accumulate from companioning someone else and watching their suffering and their death. It's not the same as burnout. Burnout has more to do with being overwhelmed with job responsibilities. But when you put the two together, it's a pretty heavy burden after a while.
Really appreciate that. That's a great distinction. Really helps with understanding. You know, Jerry, I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. Well, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I'm going to use myself as like a dumb hospice for dummies case study here.
Okay.
Let's say that I'm interested in providing some volunteering for a local hospice in my community. And I know that there's some required training that I'll have to do, but I identify as a highly sensitive person, and I can relate and familiarize with some of these empathic qualities that Helen, you spoke to. So Jerry, if I go get the training and then, you know, I feel like I'm prepared, but I recognize I'm not ready, right? I'm perhaps intimidated or a little bit fearful. I can feel how vulnerable a lot of these experiences are in the setting, or how sensitive many of the people who I'm working with are. Where would you meet me in your role as a spiritual counselor, recognizing that I could use some extra support there?
I think you've probably asked the right person that question, because I also identify as a highly sensitive person, very empathic, extremely compassionate. So, you know, my understanding of where you are in that would help as well. So what you're asking is, what kind of role would be good for you in that, or what kind of advice would I give you as someone who is also a highly sensitive person?
Probably the latter, perhaps advice as far as like start here if you're feeling that way.
Mm-hmm. If you're actually going to be with patients and families, it's good to recognize that you will walk into situations that are highly charged emotionally, that you would be walking into those kinds of situations, and prepare yourself for that. I think preparation is part of the key, is knowing in advance that you could be walking into a very highly charged emotional situation, either because of grief that's there, or because of just the dynamic that's there in that situation. And so once you're prepared for that, I think it helps you to be able to control the emotions a little bit better, control your own personal emotions a little bit better. And so that would be one piece of advice that I would give you. And then once the situation is past and you're out of the space of the patient and the family and back into your own space, let yourself process that. Let yourself process what happened. Have the emotions that you need to have at that point while you're by yourself, and then when you go, back home with your family or other people, be able to let it go, to just not carry it with you. You can't continue to carry other people's burdens with you wherever you go, and I've had trouble doing that. And I've had to learn through the years to let some of those things go and not carry other people's burdens all the time. As counselors are trained to do that very thing too. They hear people's problems all day long. They can't go home and carry those burdens with them. It's the same way as a spiritual counselor in hospice. We just can't carry everybody's burdens all the time, or we actually do suffer from compassion fatigue, that, like Helen was talking about. It becomes important to do that as well. So preparation before you go in, understanding what you're walking into, being able to control your emotions while you're there, and then later to process those emotions and able to let it out and to be then back to you again without other people's burdens.
Absolutely beautiful. My heart softens hearing that. So thank you. Okay, I've been really excited to come back to this, and it's what we opened up with as far as end of life care and being focused about quality of life as opposed to the whole death experience. I'll be very transparent in saying it's very easy, even in my role as a grief educator and grief support person, to think about death, to focus on death when I hear about hospice or put myself in an environment that's hospice related. And so let's open up the discussion a bit about that transition or that paradigm shift towards more quality of life or quality care in the end of life. Helen, what thought comes up first in regards to flipping that script?
We struggle with this in hospice because there's so much misinformation, misunderstanding. I think the word that comes to me is upstream conversations, so that people don't come to their hospice care exhausted and frightened and so close to death that we can't be as successful as we would if we came to you earlier in a disease trajectory. And a lot of that goes back to education. That's, again, one of the reasons we started the podcast. But when we have time to really engage with a patient and a family and to educate them on the roles of all these different disciplines on a team, because a hospice team brings so many different facets of care to promote quality of life for a patient. The patient has a much better experience. They relax, they lean into it, and it's not all focused on the death. That's not every conversation we have. That's going to be part of the care we provide, because how irresponsible would we be if we talked about all these other things, but we don't actually talk to you about what your death will be like and how we're going to support you through that and how we're going to support your family. So I think talking about those conversations earlier, being honest and open and helping people to really get comfortable in that space, because really it's all about being uncomfortable. It's about fear. It's about fear, right? Nobody wants to die. It's a fearful thing. It's an unknown. You only experience the death of your mother one time. You only experience the death of this spouse one time, the death of your child one time. You only have one chance to get it right. And I think upstream conversations, the education, having it earlier, getting people comfortable, I think that's what resonates most with me.
One follow-up question, Helen, in regards to the quality care, does it, high percentage wise, 9 times out of 10 or something, always begin with the patient? I was listening and sometimes thinking, well, wait a minute. I've heard stories about, the adult child, like wanting to come in and have a lot of sense of control because their parent is already, having so many health complications that they can't necessarily think for themselves or something. And so logistically speaking, that conversation, that quality care conversation, does that always begin with the patient, or can it sometimes be with someone else?
It typically begins with the patient, but because the way hospice philosophy is set up, we're caring for the patient and whoever the patient calls family. It could be friends, it's just whoever the patient calls their family. We care for both groups. We call it the unit of care. But we do have patients that have passed beyond being able to make their own decisions, or they're so confused that they can't, in a healthy way, make their own decisions. So yes, a lot of times we are dealing only with the caregivers, only with the little village of people that are taking care. Sometimes we're dealing with facility staff because a patient is living in a long-term care facility or a personal care home, and maybe their family members aren't their direct caregivers. So, we're dealing with all of those people who are included in the unit of care. And what a lot of people don't know is that the reason it's so important, and I think so valuable, that we are providing care to the family as they're doing this end-of-life journey with their loved one, is that we provide bereavement care after someone dies. So if you're a patient, once your time with hospice care is done, we're still going to take care of your family for up to a year after the death. And a lot of people don't know that about hospice. It's a very unique feature. But bereavement care is a very special aspect of what we do. So you can't just care for the patient or just care for the family. There's this whole it's a circle of care that we provide that you have to have balance. And I think caring for the patient and the caregiver, it's vital to the success of the whole thing.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen. Jerry, I was going to ask you if there's a personal story that comes to mind as far as an aha moment in helping explain or helping articulate this distinction between end-of-life care being a quality care experience as opposed to preparing someone for death. Is there something that comes to mind as far as either with a patient or with a caregiver or family member where it was just a beautiful exchange in the understanding?
I think the aha moment was actually my moment more than something that I observed. When I began in hospice, I felt like that my role was more to be, just present, be there, offer a time of visitation with the family and the patient, pray with them, and I would be gone. And the aha moment for me was when I realized that my role was so much bigger than that. That as a spiritual counselor, it was more than just doing what I call a pat and a prayer. You go in and you pat their hand and you pray with them. It became much deeper than that. My role is to also educate them. It's really the entire team's job to educate the patient and the family. And so that's part of what I do as well as a spiritual counselor, is to educate them, to give them more than just the prayer, but to provide them with the understanding of what all of us do and to prepare them for what's coming ahead and to make sure that they are prepared for that moment, not only the patient, but the family as well. And so as I became more aware of that, my work became much deeper, much more meaningful. And so I don't know that there was actually that one moment where, I had a light bulb moment, but I think it was several over a long period of time as I began to expand the role of a spiritual counselor in my mind. And it really has helped me. It helped me too to understand that what we do is not just about the death event, that it's really about preparing them for the death event and giving them as much quality of life as we can before that. And that means a lot as well, is to prepare them for that. And in preparing them for it, we're giving them a quality of life before the death happens. So that was a lot of it as well, because death is not really a medical event. This is something that we've heard from a lot of people who work in hospice. Death is not a medical event. Death is a communal event. It's an event that involves family. It involves this whole group of people who are connected with this person. But it's not a medical event. And so when that idea really came home to me, it opened up a new understanding as well. And so through the 11 years that I've worked in hospice, there have been these aha moments that helped me to understand the greater worth and the greater work of what hospice is really all about.
Really appreciate that. I think I just wrote it down, open up to new understandings. I really think that that's the essence of our conversation today with both you, Jerry, and Helen from the Heart of Hospice. You're really helping to seek new understandings because there's a lot of preconceived notions in the line of work that you do. And I'm very grateful that we've had this conversation. I'm very grateful that you're doing the work you do. Your heart's in it, your mind's in it. And what's beautiful in the experience is that people gravitate towards it because they're understanding the value of it too. Before we say goodbye, Helen, is there any last parting words you want to say in regards to anything left unsaid about the Heart of Hospice and or your role there?
I would say I've never heard such a word that really seemed accurate as what you just said, preconceived notions. So I would tell anybody that needs to research and get information about hospice care to keep an open mind. You really can't know what it's like until you've experienced it personally or professionally. So go into it with an open mind. There's an incredible amount of reward and value and just amazing work to be done in hospice care.
Awesome. How about you, Jerry? Any final thoughts?
One of the things that really keeps us going, and we've been doing this now with the podcast for over 5 years, is this idea that we don't want to ever hear someone say, I wish I had known about this sooner. Because hospice is a valuable service that gives so much value to people at their end of life journey. And yet there are so many times when people will say, I just wish I had known about this sooner. And so if we can keep that from happening by educating people about the value and the worth of hospice, we're going to continue to keep doing our podcast.
Wonderfully said. Well, the Heart of Hospice is very mission driven. We're very lucky to have both of you, Jerry Fenter and Helen Bauer. Thanks for being a part of Grief Refuge.
Thank you, Reed.
Thank you so much, Reed.
A special thanks to Helen and Jerry, and a special thanks to you for listening. Please visit the Heart of Hospice website to learn more about Helen and Jerry's work. Their website is theheartofhospice.com. I'm deeply grateful for your trust in Grief Refuge and our mission. Our mission is to help the grieving find peace and purpose after loss. Honoring grief is important work, and although painful, it's worth the time and the attention for helping to heal your heart, mind, and soul. To get more stories, more reflections, and more grief-related insights to help support you, grab the Grief Refuge app, available to download for free from the App Store that's on your smartphone. Thank you, take care, keep honoring your grief, be kind to yourself, and talk to you soon.